This is Stingray, host of The Stingray Show, reminding you if you like our content and you like our episodes, wherever you are listening to this from, whether it be YouTube or on Spotify, make sure you subscribe to our content for all of the latest information and latest episodes. And without further ado, here is another great episode, so enjoy and continue listening. Are you looking for a place of business where they focus on customer service as their number one priority? Residents of Tuscaloosa have depended on this butcher shop since 1999. I'm talking about South's Finest Meats right here in Tuscaloosa. They offer fresh beef, turkey, and chicken, as well as their specialty meats, which are favorites like pig's feet, pigtails, and chitlins. You can find South's Finest Meats at 3201 10th Avenue right there in Tuscaloosa. Go by South's Finest Meats today, where you can expect to be treated like an MVP only at South's Finest Meats. You are about to be locked inside the Stingray Show, and coming up on this edition, we have a gentleman about to join us who has over 30 years of experience in sports administration. Before becoming the athletic director at the University of Alabama, he was the athletic director at Mississippi State and then at the University of Arizona. Ladies and gentlemen, Greg Byrne, the Alabama 17th athletic director, will join us right after this open, right here on the Stingray Show.
Hi, this is Tim Brando with a reminder. Those of you on Tide 100.9, look out. You're about to feel the buzz of Stingray.
This is Stephen Ray, a.k.a. Stingray, coming to you live from Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
I'm Heath Hopkins. I'm here in DeSoto County, Mississippi, right outside of Memphis, Tennessee.
You know, Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you feel that responsibility to pay it forward and give some kid a chance coming up in the ranks, kind of like Tony did for you?
Why do you think I'm talking to Stingray tonight?
Thank you, man. I appreciate
that.
No,
I mean, look, no.
Hey, Stingray, here's the deal. When you get involved with Texas, it's like getting married to a stripper. and let me explain this. It looks good. It's kind of sexy on the surface. Yeah. But then you get the baggage, you get the drama, you get all that eventually comes with it. And that's what you get with Texas, and that's what the Big 12 learned.
And Heath, any thoughts on our show moving forward?
Hey, to everyone in Tuscaloosa listening here on Tide 100.9, with the Stingray Show, if you don't like it, you better learn to love it, because it's the best show going today, baby. Woo!
Ladies and gentlemen, with all of that, we want to welcome you inside another edition of the Stingray Show. And as Heath Hopkins said right there, it's the best show going today, baby. Woo! And the reason behind that is because of the big guests that we bring on the Stingray Show. And today we are talking with Alabama's current athletic director, Greg Byrne.
Yeah, Stephen, Greg grew up in the business. His dad was at Texas A&M. Greg was at Mississippi State, did a phenomenal job, took over the longtime athletic director, Larry Templeton.
Yes.
Greg moved on back to the desert, went to Arizona, and now he's here in Tuscaloosa. I have lots of questions for Greg, what it was like growing up in the business, and what was it like in that first stop at Mississippi State? Because you always learn on your first job and make your mistakes. So we want to hear some of the fun stories of the do's and don'ts of being an athletic director in the SEC.
So real quick, let's run down the coaches that Greg Byrne has hired. First at Mississippi State, he had to do Dan Mullen as well as John Cohen, the current athletic director at Auburn, who was the baseball coach over at Mississippi State. Then while he was at Arizona, he hired Rich Rodriguez. And then here at Alabama, he went on to hire Nate Oats, Rob Vaughn, and then, of course, most recently, Kalen DeBoer. Ladies and gentlemen, please help us welcome to the Stingray Show, Mr. Greg Byrne. Greg, how are things with you? And thank you for joining us here on the Stingray Show.
Good morning, guys. Good to be on. I told you offline, but I got to apologize in advance. Regina, my wife, is about as sick as I've seen her, and so yesterday, and so I was around the house a little bit trying to help this morning before I came in. So I'm a little behind schedule and haven't quite got a shave yet today, but I will here very soon. So hopefully the Alabama fan base won't be too embarrassed with my looks, which that's always a struggle to begin with.
Greg, I think it's been a couple of years since Stephen and I have had a razor ourselves, so the beard has set in for us.
There you go. I couldn't really grow one until a few years ago, so I couldn't put it together like the two of you can.
Thank you.
Well, Greg, I wanted to ask you. You grew up in the business, and your dad was AD there at Texas A&M. What was it like growing up in this business, and who was your first favorite player? Because I'm sure you were a little guy and was always around this. Who was your first favorite player and your first favorite head coach?
Yeah, so I grew up in it. There's a picture of my dad and I in 1977 to my right at the University of New Mexico, where it was high-level fundraising. It was a walkathon that we keep here in the office. And but so he became AD at Oregon in 1983. I was in 6th grade, and and so Rich Brooks was his football coach, who later I was in Kentucky when we hired Coach Brooks. Mitch Barnhart's the AD there, and he hired Rich and did a great job there. Probably the best coach. I know Stoops has done a good job, but probably the best coach since Bear Bryant at Kentucky.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so really it was those early Oregon teams. And guys, it was Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, who I've known since I was 15 years old. He was building his little sneaker company at that point. And so he certainly Oregon didn't have two nickels to rub together. They were broke. And actually my dad would put me to work all the time because I was free child labor. I'm sure he was violating all sorts of child labor laws at the time. And anyways, that's all they could do. They didn't have any resources, and you had to wear so many hats. But I think probably my first favorite player was Chris Miller, who was the quarterback at Oregon in the 80s and then played for the Falcons for a long time and I think he got him to the NFC. I always forget which teams are in which division, but I think NFC championship game to go to the Super Bowl. Chris and I are still friends to this day and hear from him every once in a while, but he was a great athlete, and I played a lot of sports with him. But he was probably my early first favorite athlete as a kid that I still remember to this day.
Wow.
So, Greg, some of your first jobs were at the University of Oregon, Oregon State, and Kentucky. What were some of the highlights of each of those jobs, please?
So I think I'm a freshman in college at Oregon, and I was either going to play small college basketball or go to a big school. I had a hard time staying healthy in some ways. I mean, I'm sitting here with a bag of ice on my hip right now, right?
Wow.
So I've got all the old sports injuries that are acting up. But so I ended up going to Oregon, and my dad was the AD my freshman year. Then he went to Nebraska going into my sophomore year. And so he hired Jerry Green as the men's basketball coach, who later became the coach of Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And he was on Roy Williams' staff. So I asked my dad at that time, I said, please tell me everything that you can about this. And he was very open to me about it. And he said, if you tell anybody one word about this, I'll never speak to you again about this. So obviously I learned how to keep a secret at an early age. And I always remember, so back then you didn't have cell phones, or if you did, I think he had a bag phone. You didn't have the internet. You didn't have all these things. So he actually taught me to go watch coaches coach. And I've learned a lot from watching coaches on our staff and watching coaches on TV, but you can't replicate it like going and seeing them live in person. For instance, I watched anything I could on YouTube about Kalen DeBoer over the last few years. I watched and other coaches as well.
So, Greg, I hate to cut you off there, but we are up against our first break here on Tide 100.9, and when we come back, we are going to dive into the current state of college athletics with you and talk about your thoughts on the NIL and the transfer portal. That's on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Stingray Show. AD Greg Byrne will return with us right after this short break. And with that, we want to welcome you back inside the Stingray Show, and let's continue now with Alabama Athletic Director Greg Byrne talking about the current situation on the Alabama Athletic Department with the NIL and the transfer portal. So, Greg, getting to current day stuff, with you being an athletic director there at Alabama, what are your thoughts on the current state of college athletics, in particular with the NIL and the transfer portal, and how would you like to see each one fixed?
Well, we could probably have a 2 or 3 hour podcast about that. It's listen, it's very challenging. I think about Coach Saban all the time, and one of the things he's talked about publicly, but he and I would talk about too, is I get to do this. I don't have to do this, right? And so as we're trying to tackle these very complicated issues, we were probably very slow to change in college sports, but there's a reason for that. We're a very challenging model. I got the picture behind me of all of our teams being represented. We have one sport that turns a healthy profit in football. We have one that turns a bit of a profit in men's basketball, and we have 19 that lose a lot of money, all into seven figures, and some into mid seven figures on their net loss on an annual basis. And so football has allowed those other sports to exist and happen because obviously we take it very seriously here at Alabama, college sports as a whole, football for sure, and men's basketball, and it's good to see the progress of our women's team this year too, and obviously great history in gymnastics and softball and golf and a lot of other sports that I'm not intentionally leaving out. And so you get to be around these kids on a daily basis, and you see how hard they work at their craft and what they do to try to be as good as they can be. And to be at Alabama, you got to be really good. I was a good athlete growing up. I played everything. I loved everything. But if Wimp Sanderson ever saw me play, he'd probably say, that's the kid I don't want to recruit to Alabama because I want to win. But it was something where, you understood that here at this level, you get the elite level kids to be able to come here. But you got to pay for it. And the late, great Cecil Hurt told me one day, we were talking about something, and he said, Greg, people are really good at spending other people's money. And because as much as we want to be all things to all people, you can't, right? You have to keep the main thing. You got to make sure you're successful in football because that impacts everything else that we do, right? So trying to find what that right balance is to where we can continue to have broad-based programming, have Olympic sports that, again, we're very passionate about. I'm really proud as a department that we're finishing pretty on a pretty regular basis in the top 10 to 15 in the Directors Cup, which is the overall performance of your athletic department. And I think fans would be surprised to hear we have 16 head coaches. A couple of them are at the top of the market. Okay. A couple of them, a handful of them are. The rest of them really aren't. They're middle to the lower half of the league from a salary standpoint because of the fiduciary responsibility we have to balance our budget. And so those economic realities of what we're facing on a daily basis are very challenging. And we want to be able to find a model long-term that allows that. So with the settlement that's going on with the House litigation, I'd encourage your listeners to look up House litigation and see about it. But basically there's a potential settlement that may get finalized later this spring. And in there's $2.8 billion in back damages. 2.8 billion, not million, but billion, that's going to be shared across college sports, but the majority of the heavy lifting is going to come from the SEC, Big Ten, ACC, and Big 12, from the which we now call the Autonomy 4 conferences.
Yeah.
Then going forward, there's an opportunity for revenue sharing that will be around $20 million plus some additional scholarship costs, because part of the settlement is that the courts have decided that scholarship limits are illegal. Roster limits are not, because you got to have some type of cap on what you're doing from how you put teams together. And so you're probably looking at about a $25 million in new revenue without a new revenue stream. And so we're trying to find what that right balance is, and the fine line we walk. And one of the things I do want our fans to know, I as the AD, we as a department are very sensitive to, is we have to obviously generate the revenue to be able to compete at the highest levels of college sports, because that's the waters we're in, and that's what we expect, and that's what our fans expect. And at the same time, too, we realize that, we're not the wealthiest state in the world. And we have a balance there to where, if you look at marketability, for instance, of our football tickets, and you look at the secondary market, which we study pretty extensively, a lot of our tickets are actually probably undervalued. And we're fairly aggressive in what we charge for those, but we also need to do that to be able to make everything else work. But we also don't take those things lightly. So there's a lot of push and pull right now that's going on in college sports. I'm hopeful that the House settlement, if it goes through, one of the parts of it is that there's supposed to be fair market value when it comes to what takes place from a name, image, and likeness marketing deal standpoint. If you look in the NFL, most of the offensive linemen in the NFL don't have marketing deals because there's not a huge market for them. Okay. But understandably, because of recruiting at our place, they all do. Right. And so if all of a sudden we can have it be where it's more market driven and it's legitimate opportunities, which is what they have in the professional ranks, that gives us a chance to have a sustainable model for the long haul. That allows us to have broad-based programming, that allows us to Alabama to make sure we can stay competitive in the marketplace from a coaching standpoint. One of my favorite sayings, guys, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, but one of my favorite sayings is today's gift is tomorrow's expectation.
Yeah.
Okay. The way we serve our kids is as good as any country, as any athletic department in the country.
Yes.
And I'm not going to tell you which kid it was, but Thanksgiving Day, I watched one of our professional athletes play in the NFL, and I watched their game. The next late morning, that young man is in our training room right below me. And I went up to him. I said, "Man, what are you doing here? I just watched you last night." And he said, "I get better care here than I do in the NFL."
Wow.
Okay. That costs money.
Right.
Right. Our medical costs have gone up almost $4 million in the last 4 years. Right. As soon as you take away that level of service from somebody, that's not going to go over well.
Right.
Right. There's a lot of risk when it comes to, I'm proud of how we invest medically in our kids. I'm proud of how and it's not just football, it's across the board. I'm proud of how we invest from a nutrition standpoint, how we invest from a strength and conditioning standpoint, from a life skills and development standpoint, how we invest from a mental health standpoint. It's really, really good. And in one of the trips Coach Saban and I've gone up to DC on, we did a bipartisan roundtable that Senator Cruz sponsored. And I'm sitting, Senator Cruz, Coach Saban, myself, and then the Cavender twins from Miami, and a few other people in college sports and attorneys. And there were a lot of senators in the room. And I talked about the investments that we make in our young people here.
Right.
And one of the senators who's been pro-union, pro-employee came up to me afterwards and he said, "Man, that's really good information. We just need to get everybody to do what Alabama does." And I said, "Senator, we do it at a really high level as well as anybody, but there are other schools that do it too, and I don't think we get any credit for it." So, anyways, I'll stop with that. It's complicated. We're going to do. Dr. Bell, our president, has been one of the leaders in the SEC. I'm trying to lead in this as well, but it's not just a snap of the fingers and everything can get fixed. It took a long time to get in the position we're in, and it's going to take a while to get out of it too.
Yes.
Greg, a fun follow-up question before I get to my question. Was Senator Tommy Tuberville in that room?
Yes, we saw him that day. Yes.
Were there any jokes made?
No, not really. I mean,
Right.
he's he obviously now knows he needs to make sure that he keeps the Alabama faithful happy too. So
Yes.
That's right. That's
but-
right.
yeah, I've known Senator Tuberville, now you call him, for a long time, and certainly when I found out he was going to run for the Senate, I'm like, wow, that's interesting. And then he won. So
Yeah.
so we're certainly glad to have him be our senator.
We hope that you are thoroughly enjoying this interview with Greg Byrne, and unfortunately, we are up against another break, and when we come back, we are going to dive into the hiring process of A.D. Byrne when he was at Mississippi State hiring Dan Mullen. That's on the other side of the break. You're listening to The Stingray Show. A.D. Greg Byrne will return with us right after this commercial break. Strange Brew Coffee House continues to roll out brand new drinks, including the Yosemite, which is white chocolate and roasted marshmallow. Doesn't that sound amazing? You can find Strange Brew at 1101 University Boulevard, right there on the strip at the University of Alabama campus. And hey, did you know that you can get Strange Brew delivered to your door? Check out strangebrewcoffeehouse.com for all the Strange Brew's bags of coffee, K-Cups, mugs, shirts, and a whole lot more right there at strangebrewcoffeehouse.com. And we want to welcome you back inside the Stingray Show. Let's continue our interview with A.D. Greg Byrne of Alabama, talking about when he became the A.D. at Mississippi State and hired head coach Dan Mullen.
You're listening to the Stingray Show. Greg Byrne, the athletic director for the University of Alabama, is our guest. Greg, we've had Dan Mullen on the show multiple times. And Dan told this great story of when he was being interviewed for the Mississippi State head coaching job, that he was leaving practice, took a quick shower, was driving like Batman to get to the airport, to get on a plane, and his phone starts ringing, and he notices that it's on the windshield outside the car.
Oh, was it really? I didn't know that part.
Yeah, he was throwing all of his stuff in the car, and he had put his phone on top of the windshield wiper. And he said, I'm doing like 85, 90 trying to get to the airport. And he said, and my phone starts ringing. It's my wife. And so he tells the story and flies to Atlanta, and you guys meet and all this kind of stuff. But when you're an athletic director for the first time and you've got to make that first hire, is the pressure on you? Or you're like, is this how we do it? Do you call your dad like, Dad, how'd you do this? What's going on? What's it like the first time you're an athletic director and you've got to make a big time hire?
Well, first of all, I was very fortunate that I worked for Mitch Barnhart for 7 years, who's still the AD at Kentucky.
Yeah,
I think he
great
may be the
athletic
longest serving AD in the country for 7 years. And Mitch gave me a lot of opportunities to be part of hiring, including Rich Brooks when we hired him as the football coach, and John Cohen when we hired him as the baseball coach at Kentucky. And then when I was at Mississippi State, I hired him from Kentucky, which Mitch wasn't real happy with me about that for a little while. But obviously, I understand why too. That's a tough thing to do. I actually used a headhunter during that time. During that search, which I really only have one other time since then. And one of the things I found out is my Rolodex is pretty strong. And so I was able to get whoever I wanted to on the phone fairly quickly because of the contacts that I have. And so we didn't have the transfer portal. We didn't have NIL. So you had more time to deal with. Well, I'd watched my dad when he was hiring a men's basketball coach at Oregon. He went out and got on a commercial flight, flew across the country. He went to Cincinnati and outside of Boston on the same trip. And he came back and I said, well, tell me all about the trip. And he said, and he actually was doing this during the course of the season because he thought he was going to have to make a change. And he said, well, I went to Cincinnati. I saw this young guy named Huggins. He said, but I can't put anybody behind the bench because, boy, he could swear like none other. And I thought he could really swear. And then I go to Massachusetts and I see this young coach named Calipari, and he was really good at it too.
Right.
So he ended up, and I think Cal went to the NBA from UMass maybe that same year. and Huggins stayed at Cincinnati for a long time. But then he ended up hiring Jerry Green off Roy Williams' staff. So I got to watch it early on. So when I hired Dan, one of the things that when I don't like the word when we hired Dan, one of the things I like to say is or stories to tell is I was talking to Chuck Ninus, who was our headhunter on the search, and I said to Chuck, I said, man, I just don't want leaks, because agents will try to get leaks out there, and the fan base will say, oh, this guy turned you down, that guy turned you down. When in reality, you may hire your first, second, or third choice, but it looks like you're hiring your eighth choice because all the games that are being played.
Right.
So I said to Chuck, I said, and I'm 36 years old then, and I said to Chuck, I said, hey, what if we tell the candidates that we're talking to that if it leaks out that they've interviewed for the job, or that you're talking to me, that I'll just assume you don't want the job. And I said, has anybody ever done that? And Chuck said, no. He always called me Gregor. Chuck's still alive. And Gregor, no, nobody's ever done that. I said, well, let's try it. And he said, okay, let's try it. It worked. And in fact, Dan had Urban Meyer come out and said that Dan had talked to us. And it was after the SEC championship game between Alabama and Florida when he had Tebow his junior year. And so I cut Dan off for about a day. I wouldn't talk to him. And all I had done was have a phone interview with him, because Florida said you can't talk to him the week of the SEC championship game. And so we didn't, and talked to other candidates during that time. Well, Urban comes out and says, yeah, Dan's talking to Mississippi State. And little did I know that may have been a plant there, not by Dan. And so I decided to meet him at 9:30 the next night in Atlanta, after he practiced and had to go recruiting and all these things. And we hired him, offered him the job at 2:30 in the morning. And we finalized it about 6 the next morning, and that's how he became Mississippi State's coach.
Wow. Greg, a quick fun story to follow that up. I asked Dan, I was like, what do you guys eating in the room? Or do you order a pizzas or caviar set up in the corner? I mean, do you go to a restaurant? And he said, I was scared to eat. He goes, because 95% of the time, I always drop something on my shirt. So I told my wife, like, I'm just not going to eat. He said, I ate on the plane, and I just refused to eat the rest of the time, which made us laugh. But I've got to ask, who finished number 2? If you didn't get Dan, who was the backup that you were going to hire at Mississippi State that time?
I can't say.
Right.
Okay.
He's still coaching though.
Yeah, I got you.
And
but still head coaching?
He's still coaching. And I don't know if I've said this publicly or not. I was starting to get focused on this coach, and it's why it's so important to have people around you that I tell our executive team all the time, don't tell me what I want to hear, tell me what I need to know.
Yes.
Okay. Because people are afraid to say that to leaders at times. And so Regina, so the search committee was John Cohen, who's now the AD at Auburn, me, and then Scott Strickland, who's now the AD at Florida. It was the three of us, and then a guy named Mike Nemeth, who's retired there. He was helping us too. And we were starting to get focused on this other coach, and we had come back from Dallas. And what I did back then is I brought Regina in at the end to meet the spouse, because happy wife, happy life, right? And so I bring her in at the end to meet this other coach's spouse. And Regina said to me, she said, you're not comfortable. I can tell you're not comfortable with this person. And she said to me, what about Tim Tebow's coach? And I said, well, Urban came out and talked, and I said, they're out if it's leaks. And she looked at me and she said, do you think Urban may have done that on purpose? And the four of us who were going through this hadn't even crossed our mind. And she said, I bet you Urban did it on purpose. If it wasn't for Regina Byrne, Dan Mullen would never have become the football coach at Mississippi State.
Wow.
God's honest truth. And so she talked me into talking to him. Again, we'd already talked to him on the phone because we didn't have Zoom back then. And so we met him that night in Atlanta at 9:30 at night and fell in love with him. And we hired him that night. And obviously Dan's, the best coach Mississippi State's probably ever had, right?
Yeah, you get more inside knowledge to this. Do you think Urban did leak that on purpose? If you had to guess,
I don't know. I don't know Urban that well. I know him a little bit. I'm guessing he just was talking about I think there were open jobs at the time, and I think he was asked about Dan and Charlie Strong. Charlie was his defensive coordinator, and I think Dan talked about it.
So you said yes, right?
Yes. No, I did not say yes. A definite maybe.
So we are up against our final break, and when we come back, we are going to dive into AD Greg Byrne transitioning from Mississippi State to the University of Arizona. That's on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Stingray Show. We will finish up this interview with AD Greg Byrne right after this commercial break. Super Bowl 59 is fastly approaching on February the 9th, and what goes well with the Super Bowl? Chicken wings. And let me tell you about the wing deal that the Coker Market has for the Super Bowl. You can get smoked wings by the dozen, that is 12 smoked wings for $16.99. Now your choice of dressing includes buffalo, Jamaican jerk, Japanese barbecue, white barbecue, or lemon pepper. That is smoked wings by the dozen for $16.99 at the Coker Market, located on County Road 140 in Coker, Alabama. And we want to welcome you back inside the final segment of the Stingray Show. We hope that you are thoroughly enjoying this interview with Greg Byrne, and unfortunately, we've got about 30 more minutes of content with Greg, so what we're going to do is we are going to get in as much as we can tonight, and then the rest of it will air on the Friday evening edition of the Stingray Show. So let's go on ahead and finish up what we can this evening with our interview with Greg Byrne. So Greg, after 2 seasons of athletic director at Mississippi State, you moved on to be the AD at Arizona. What made you decide to switch from Mississippi State to the University of Arizona?
It was actually a really tough decision, Stingray. We really like our kids were in middle school at that point in Starkville. We had developed some really good friends there, and felt like we had a chance to do some things that hadn't been done before, and they'd had some success in the past. So please don't take it as though we reinvented the wheel. Larry Templeton had a lot of good things happen, and a lot of good coaches, including Coach Kroom and Jackie Sherrill and such. And so, basically, at the end of the day, I got contacted about Arizona by Cedric Dempsey, who used to be the president of the NCAA. And I'd known Dr. Dempsey since I was in 6th grade, back when he was AD at Arizona and my dad was AD at Oregon. And then he left Arizona to become president of the NCAA. And so somebody I greatly admired, and I had told him no twice. I was not going to talk to Arizona. Had just hired Dan, had just hired John Cohen as the baseball coach, and wanted to, ride that train for a while and see what we could do.
Yes.
And so it's kind of, said Dempsey's kind of like the godfather a lot of ways in our industry. And at some point he basically said to me, he said, "Greg, you're going to take this job." And I was like, "Yeah, yes, Godfather, I guess I am." And we struggled with it. I'm not too proud to say I shed a lot of tears over leaving Starkville,
Right.
because of how much we cared about the place and how much we cared for the people there. And, there's a lot of crossover between Mississippi State and Alabama.
Yes.
And so it was a really tough decision. We had 7 really exciting, challenging years at Arizona. It's a different place. You're 70 miles from the border there of Mexico. I always jokingly would say the kids run around in their swimsuits all year round because of the weather. And we didn't have the resources. It's Tucson's is a good town. We liked living there, but it's economically not real strong.
Right.
And it was every year we were trying to rub nickels together to make it work. So after 7 years there, when Alabama came calling, I was really excited and honored to get that call, not to jump ahead there.
Fun. Well, so Greg, while you were there at Arizona in 2012, you made the decision to move Arizona's baseball team from the on-campus stadium to an off-campus stadium, and with that decision, you got a regional, a super regional, and they went on to win the College World Series. Talk about that entire situation and what it was like to watch Arizona win a national championship in baseball.
I love all the sports. Okay. I love baseball too. And, that was probably my best sport growing up. And I stopped playing in high school to play golf. And my baseball coach was not real happy, when I said that, or when I told him I wasn't going to come out for the team. Cause I'm tall and I could throw it pretty hard, and probably half the kids I'd hit and the other kids would be scared so I could strike them out. And, it's an interesting strategy, right? But it was, so Arizona had won, I think, 3 national championships under Coach Kendall in the 70s and 80s in baseball.
Right.
And so they had a rich history, but they'd only been to Omaha one time in 30 years. They hadn't hosted a regional in 30 years, had never hosted a super regional, because the home stadium, which was named after Coach Kendall, was not very good. In fact, it was bad. Didn't even have a dressing room for our team. We had to dress over the basketball arena. Had one concession stand, one men's room, one women's room. If I remember right, the men's room would lock from the outside with one toilet. So it wasn't an ideal situation.
Right.
So it's since been torn down as football practice fields and an indoor now for Arizona. So High Corbett, for those of you who are my age, this generation, if you remember the original movie Major League, it was filmed at High Corbett, Willie Mays Hayes and all that. And it was sitting empty 2 miles from Arizona's campus. And so they had clubhouses. Now it was old, but they had clubhouses. They had, because spring training had been there and minor league baseball had been there. And they had concession stands and all these novel concepts. And so I asked our president, I said, hey, I think I'd like to move off campus, have us move the baseball team there. And Coach Lopez, who used to be at Florida, was our baseball coach, right? And he, and Andy was great. And he's like, yeah, he'd always call me Gregor as well. And he said, Gregor, I think that's a great move. Let's do this. So I got permission from our president. I got permission for us to start selling beer. And so we moved off campus and we went from drawing flies at games to leading. I think other than Fayetteville, west of the Mississippi, it was the largest college baseball crowd on average that year, the years leading up to it. So had a good team. Got to host our first regional in 30 years, won that. Hosted our first super regional ever, won that. We get to Omaha, and we had only been one time in 30 years. I'm like, dang. So we go to Omaha and win the national championship. And I always remember, I've actually got the picture right over here. It's the only Arizona picture I have in my office. When you win a championship, sometimes the AD has a place they're supposed to stand up on the stage. It's about the kids and it's about the coaches. It's not about the AD, right? So I'm standing over off to the side on the grass off the stage, and Andy Lopez stops the ceremony live on ESPN and says, hey, we're not taking this without Gregor being up here, because he said Greg got his teeth kicked in moving us off campus. I had a lot of our former players who were against the move, and saying it was the wrong thing to do. And there was letters to the editor saying I should be fired because I was dishonest. And it's like, I couldn't have been more honest about the thing. Very transparent on the front end. And so certainly I didn't know we were going to win the national championship that year, but I keep that picture here for a reason. Is obviously proud of that accomplishment of what that great team did and the coaches. But sometimes you're going to have to make really challenging decisions. And sometimes you're going to make decisions that people are going to question whether they're the right ones or not. But I keep that picture there for a reason, that, hey, if you make the decisions that you think are the right thing for the long-term health of the department, then you're going to be okay. And that doesn't mean you may make a decision and at some point say, man, I didn't make the right decision at the time.
Yes.
But if you make the best decision that you can with the information that you have, not what's right for you as an individual, but what's right for the department and what's right for the university and our student athletes and the fans. And sometimes that's not always the same thing. As much as you want it to be, sometimes it's not always the same thing. And so, anyways, that picture I see on every day I'm here in the office, and it's a great reminder for me.
So, Greg, a quick little follow-up. That was your first national championship as an AD, correct?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
It was fun. It was an honor to be a part of it.
So, guys, due to time constraints, that is all the time that we have on this edition of the Stingray Show. We've got 22 minutes of content remaining with AD Greg Byrne. So when we come back on Friday at 6 p.m., we are going to play the remaining 22 minutes of the interview with Greg Byrne, and then we're going to be joined by Dave Shoemate to talk about some of the big SEC college basketball games that is this weekend. That is on the Friday evening edition of the Stingray Show. Have a wonderful Friday out there. We will finish up the Greg Byrne interview with you tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Make sure you tune in. And with that, we want to welcome you inside the Friday evening edition of the Stingray Show. Now, yesterday evening, we had Greg Byrne, Alabama's athletic director, join us to discuss his time at Mississippi State and then at Arizona. Tonight, right now, we are going to finish up the interview with AD Greg Byrne, talking all about his time since he was hired at the University of Alabama. We're going to do that for the next two segments, and then we're going to transition into college basketball talk. So here is the remaining two segments of our interview with AD Greg Byrne. So, Greg, after becoming the athletic director there at Alabama, you had to hire current basketball head coach Nate Oats. What drew you to Nate Oats and wanting him to become the Crimson Tide men's basketball coach, please?
Well, I'll tell you, blind squirrel finds a nut every once in a while, so got a little lucky on that one. But in all sincerity, you don't ever want to change coaches, okay? Yes. You want stability in your coaching staffs. What I said earlier about making the right decision for the long-term health of the department in the decisions that you make, that's the case when you change coaches, right? Not because you lost the game, not because you had a bad year. What's the right thing for the long-term health of the program? There is extreme value in stability. Okay, I can't stress that enough. But at the same time, too, if you see a coaching change coming down the path at some point, which we knew Coach Saban was going to retire at some point. We didn't want him to, but we knew it would. It would have been irresponsible on my part to just say, well, the day before he retired, when he and I talked, for me to say, oh, I guess I better start working on that, right? That would have been bad.
Right.
And so with all your sports, you want to at least have a thought process of paths you would go down. Well, Nate had been on my radar screen for a couple of years. He really got on my radar screen. I was at Alabama now at this point, but when he was at Buffalo, he beat Arizona's team, and they had, I think, DeAndre Ayton on the team, if I remember right. He was the number one pick in the draft. They beat him like a drum. And wherever I was watching that game, I mean, I was like, their offense is incredible. I mean, I was like, they don't ever shoot him from a 15-footer. No mid-range jumpers, right? Everything's at the rim. And if they're going to the rim and it's clogged in the paint, then they're going to dish the ball out. And a lot of times has some really good looks from the 3-point line. And so he got on my radar screen that way. I started reading about him. I love the fact that he had been a high school math teacher, that he understood numbers. I love the fact that he'd been selling Capri Suns out of his room, high school room, for gas money, like 6 or 7 years earlier. I love the fact that the Hurley family took him on as a high school coach to become an assistant. And obviously that's a great basketball family, incredible IQ and basketball knowledge. And so during that search, I think in a 2-day period, I interviewed, we interviewed 5 people. He was the 5th one. I was going to go interview somebody else the next day, and fell in love with Nate. Actually, that night, there was a night interview too. We went to his house and spent time with his family, and basically said as I was leaving about, I don't know, 10 o'clock that night, 11 o'clock, and I had Jeff Puritan with me, who's now the AD at Arkansas State. I said, hey, I like this. Let's sleep on it. Let's talk first thing in the morning. I had told him the same thing. If it leaks, I assume you don't want the job. And so only his family knew. And then I had called his AD and asked him to ask permission, which is the ethical thing to do. So we did that. And we came together the next morning. We hired him. And I remember thinking 98% of our fan base is going to go, who the heck is this guy? And that's where it's a lesson for ADs, for people in general. You want to win the press conference. That's always great if you can, but don't do it at the expense of getting who you think is the right coach.
Right.
Right. And when you go through a search and going back to personnel matters, as you can imagine, we're trying to do every single thing we can to find out who this person is. Sometimes with coaches or personnel in general, there's issues that 99.9% of all people have no idea about, that we can't talk about, but the reality that are challenging to allow that person to come into your department.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then if they come into your department and you find out, well, why didn't you know that? Right. And not to say everybody, nobody's perfect. So it's not like, but there's certain red flags. Well, Nate was one that I didn't think was going to necessarily, win the press conference, but I thought he was the right coach to give us something with our men's basketball program that was going to be ahead of the curve in what's taking place. One of my favorite Nick Saban sayings that coach would say to me, he said, Greg, the dinosaurs didn't adapt. So you got to continue to adapt. You got to continue to evolve.
Right.
And I thought Nate was at the forefront of evolution on the game, and you're seeing that now.
Yes.
Why this isn't? I think the leg up he has is one. He's got a tremendous work ethic.
Right.
He works his tail off, and it has that mentality within the program. And number 2, I think his mind from an analytics standpoint is as strong as anybody out there because of his math background, which I think is really helpful. So
Yes.
He's been awesome for us. I'm sure glad we hired him when we did. And obviously I'm 53 years old. I want to retire here to Alabama if I can help it.
Right.
And I hope I never work with another men's basketball coach the rest of my time.
So we are up against our first break, and when we come back, we are going to continue our interview with AD Greg Byrne. That's on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Stingray Show. We will be right back after this short commercial break with Alabama's 17th Athletic Director, Greg Byrne. And we're back inside the Stingray Show, and now let's go on ahead and continue our interview with Greg Byrne, talking about his favorite Nick Saban story.
Greg, I got to ask you, we've had a lot of former players on, and they talk so glowingly about Coach Saban. But I asked him this fun question. I was like, Coach Saban gets everybody at one time or another, right? They start smiling and laughing, or yeah. And I was like, when did Coach Saban get you? What was it about? Has Coach Saban ever got you?
Of course.
Was there something fun that he got irritated about and just was upset with you about whatever it might be?
I've been around coaches my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And to get a chance, and I think I worked with him longer than any athletic director ever worked with him.
Right.
Okay.
it was an honor, and I still work with him, right? He's still on our staff, and he and I talk multiple times a week. And he was the best I've ever been around at keeping an edge all the time. He was easiest. I don't think you mind me saying it this way. He was easiest to deal with the week of a big game. Really calm. We're playing whoever, LSU, we're playing Tennessee, we're playing whoever, Auburn. Really steady Eddie. Just it's just you know, rare flare-ups or anything like that out on the practice field or anything like that. It was the week that we were playing our FCS game, or that we were playing an underdog team, or a team that was a huge underdog to us, that it was, I mean, we were all on edge.
Wow.
And so one of the many things I appreciated about him, and I told him this early on, I said, man, I hope you and I can have a relationship where we can be very open with each other. And one of my favorite Saban stories, and I've said this one, and I've told him I've said it before, but when I'm deciding whether to take the job or not, it was 2016, and it was the year of the Clemson game down in Tampa. And so Dr. Bell and Fess St. John was our chair of our athletic committee, basically offered me the job down in Tampa. And I told him, I said, my dad went to Nebraska in 92, and he and Tom Osborne did not meet beforehand. And I said, I want to sit down with Coach Saban. Jimmy Sexton had been telling me that Coach and I would do great and get along great. And he was right. But so I said, but I want to talk to Coach Saban. And so they brought Regina and I out the next weekend. We went to their house, to the Saban's house. It was Miss Terry, Coach Saban, Regina, and me, just the four of us. And he tells the story is he looks at me, we small talked for a minute or two, and then we got right down to business, as you can imagine. And he said to me, I know you haven't signed the MOU yet. What concerns you about working with me? And I said, man, that's a heck of a question. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you asking that. And he said, well, what are they? And I said, well, number one, next week, next month, next year, you don't go back to the NFL. I was only 45 years old. And I said, I got to work for a long time, Coach. I said, if you leave quickly, our fan base is going to assume you and I didn't get along. And I said, I view this as a partnership in what we do here. And he said, no, Greg, he said, I'm going to finish my coaching career at Alabama. He did, right? Man of his word. Then he said, what's the second thing? And I said, if I have a concern about something, that I can come talk to you about it. And as you guys can imagine, I was smart. I didn't go running down the hallway on every little thing, right?
Right.
But at the same time, too, if I have a concern about something, that I could have a constructive, open conversation with them. And here's the greatest coach of all time in our generation, right?
Right.
And here he looks at me, 45-year-old schmuck like me, and he says, I'll be disappointed if you don't. And so if a guy that's one of the greatest coaches of all time of any sport in the world can say to the 45-year-old athletic director, I'm open to constructive feedback, then I sure as heck should be open to constructive feedback too. Right. And so I tell that story in business classes, and I tell that story when I'm talking to YPO groups and different, rotaries and things like that, because one of the things in the leaders that I admire the most is there's a sense of humility, and there's an openness to continue to evolve and get better. And I try to emulate that the best I can. And at times I fall short of that. But part of the reason why Regina and I have been married 30 years is a long time ago, I learned to say, yes, ma'am, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Right? Goes a long way.
Yes.
And so just having that humility to be able to do that is such a great lesson. And so when Coach and I would have a challenging conversation, I think he always felt like I was coming from a constructive place. And I think I certainly know that he was. And so that's the kind of relationship and partnership you want. And so I was really fortunate to be able to be part of that. And I honestly, guys, I'm not kidding. I would drive in the morning going, who did I fool? I mean, I get to work at Alabama. I get to work with Nick Saban. I get to work with these incredible kids and this passionate fan base. And man, I am so fortunate, and I don't ever want to take that for granted.
Wow.
So, Greg, I've got 3 questions left for you. The first one, obviously, you have hired a ton of coaches, but last year, after Coach Saban retired, how much pressure was on you to pick the right guy to replace the greatest coach of all time in college football?
And I want to add to that question.
Sure.
How many people were in that circle? Because that's going to be a super tight circle when you're trying to decide who's the next coach of Alabama. So what was that like as well?
It was really tight. President Bell, obviously, I kept him up to date the whole time. And Mike Brock, the chair of our athletic committee for our trustees, I kept him up to date the entire time. But they also understood the importance of confidentiality in this.
Right.
One of my favorite lines. There was a guy named Bill Gatton, who is the largest donor to the University of Kentucky, and I used to be the fundraiser back there. And he wanted to know something that was going on one time with Kentucky basketball. I said, Mr. Gatton, I can't tell you. And God rest his soul, he passed away about a year ago. And Mr. Gatton said to me, he said, Greg, he said, I can keep a secret. It's all the people I tell that can't keep one. I love that line. And so a lot of times, honestly, there's a lot of times I don't want to know something, because ignorance is a wonderful card. I come by it naturally, but ignorance is a wonderful card to play from time to time.
That's right.
So we kept it real tight. I had a couple people here internally that went with me. We interviewed 2 people in person. We did research on a lot of people, as you can imagine, for an extended period of time. We had a law firm that we worked with to do a bunch of background work to understand any challenges, legal, NCAA wise, family wise, anything that we could, unearth, so to speak. Then this time I brought Regina on the front end because of the transfer portal. And so when Coach Saban retired, one of the things I told him when we talked the day before, I said to him, I said, if you go through with this, I'm going to tell the team I need 72 hours. And because one is I knew I was going to have to get to Seattle, and that's not around the corner. Right.
Right.
And the second thing is we were going to do our very best to try to hold the roster together.
Yes.
And so we had 7 people here internally that we had identified. And I said, if all of you will do, and we divided up the team and said, you're going to have proactive conversations with each of these kids 2 times a day. I don't want to be reactive conversations. And if you do what you're supposed to do, you'll have a job when all's said and done. And all 7 people are still here today.
Awesome.
Okay. And so, did I feel pressure? Yes, of course. But I also knew that it wasn't going to do me any good to just kind of freak myself out over it. There's a program I use on a daily basis called Vision Pursue, and it's a kind of a wellness and I meditate, and I just started it about 8 years ago, and it really helps slow the mind down, control the controllable. I couldn't control so much of what was going on. I couldn't control, I put the tweet out that said, if you don't hear it from me, don't believe it. And I knew that wasn't going to stop the speculation, but it may slow it down a little bit. And when you go through a search, one of the things that is always, I guess, amusing a little bit, but people, and that's why I didn't read message boards. I didn't look at my Twitter account. I just kept my head down and I controlled what I could control. Right. And, but people will make assumptions and assume they have inside information about candidates, and they know their intent. They know whether they want the job or whether they don't want the job. They know what the result's going to be if we hire this coach. When we hired Nate, there was a lot of folks saying that was a terrible hire. And it worked out okay. When Rich Brooks got hired at Kentucky, Mitch got beat up bad, and I was the fundraiser.
Paul Brooks.
Yeah, ditch Mitch and Rich signs and T-shirts, right? And Coach Brooks did a great job there. And so, I just think one of the things you want to think about as you go through this is, obviously, are there good hires and bad hires? Yes, there are. But what you do as the AD is you do the very best you can with the information that you have. Right. And obviously you have information, hopefully, that not everybody else has. But you make the best decisions that you can that you think will fit with your university and your department and where you're doing. I will tell you, I think Kalen DeBoer, from an ego standpoint, from a coaching standpoint, from a culture standpoint, we couldn't ask for a better person to take on this incredible task.
Right.
And I also want folks to know how supportive Coach Saban has been too through this process, and Miss Terry as well. And that gives us the best chance, because I studied when Coach Bryant retired. I studied when Pat Summitt retired, when John Wooden retired, the truly iconic coaches, and the list is short. And it's a challenging thing to do. But one of the things I've told Coach DeBoer, I've told Dr. Bell and our trustees, and it's like, what a challenge, what an opportunity. And we're not expecting perfection through this. It's not going to happen. But what I will tell you, the way he worked Coach DeBoer and his staff worked at retaining the roster right from the get-go is pretty remarkable. And obviously it's a very fluid, challenging world. And we kept the great majority of our roster. We've done it in today's world. You got three buckets. You got high school recruiting, you got the roster retention, and then you have the transfer portal. I have no idea how that just happened. I got my
I was going to wonder what was going on myself.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody can be, this is my opinion, I don't know if anybody can be elite in all three.
Right.
Okay. And so what our focus has been high school recruiting, which we just signed the number 2 class.
Right.
Okay. Roster retention, because we have a lot of good, there it goes again. We have a lot of good kids in on our team.
Yes.
And then we'll supplement through the portal. Okay. Anybody tells you they got it figured out,
Right.
I'm not sure if that's the case.
Yes.
Again, we're going to make the best decisions that we can for our athletic department, for our football program. And so I'm excited about where we are today, and I'm excited about the future too.
So Greg,
and guys, I gotta go in like 1 minute. So
okay,
I got an alarm clock waiting for me.
You're fine. My final question for you: you were athletic director at Arizona, which is a blue blood in college basketball, Mississippi State, which is a blue blood in baseball, and then Alabama, which is a blue blood in football. Talk about the uniqueness of all three of those universities being a part of blue bloods in 3 different sports.
Yeah, obviously there's pride, there's history in all 3 of those schools and all 3 of those sports. But I also strongly believe when you have a program like that, it gives you the opportunity to shoot for success across the board. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite conversations I had with Coach Saban early on is he said, I'm not sure if we're exactly taking advantage of the historical success we're having in football to have success across the board. And he did such a great job of meeting with recruits from other sports when his schedule would allow.
Right.
He would follow our other teams and what they were doing. And so I look at that as an advantage to say, listen, baseball at Mississippi State, men's basketball at Arizona, football here at Alabama. Yeah. Why can't we be good across the board? And that's our focus. If we're gonna keep score, we might as well try to win. And we want to be focused on that on a daily basis in what we do. And I think a winning culture in one program gives you opportunities in others too.
So, Greg, I know that you're on a time crunch. Thank you for doing this, and please join us again because we've got a ton more questions to ask you.
All right, very good. Good to see y'all. Roll Tide.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
All right, so Heath, that is going to wrap up the interview with AD Greg Byrne of Alabama, who is the 17th athletic director here at Alabama. We really do want to thank him for joining us. And Heath, I got to tell you, that was really, really insightful and entertaining there from the current Alabama athletic director.
Yeah, it's always fun to hear some of the insights. And I know he can't say everything and he can't answer all the questions in detail. People are like, why didn't you push that? Why didn't you go further on this and dive deeper? Because he's still not going to say the answer. When we ask questions like, hey, who finished second at the Mississippi State job? Sometimes he can say that. Sometimes he can't. And but I did like his answer. He goes, they're still coaching today. And when I followed it up, I was like, are they head coaching? He said, they're still coaching today, which, made me snicker a little bit. So, they're in a very delicate situation. There's all kinds of legal things. And also, they have to keep faith and respect and loyalty to the people who they've talked to and who they've interviewed. They don't want to burn any bridges.
Yes.
And so you have to respect that. And if you don't, I don't care what you think. So I'm very honored that Greg spent the time that he did with us and shared all those great things.